My wife said, "Wine tasting weekend with the girls. You'd be bored." I replied, "Probably right." Then I drove past the vineyard and saw her car at a nearby motel. Room 12. I took photos. She came home to an empty house and a lawyer's card. But let me back up and tell you how this whole thing started. The announcement came on a Tuesday evening while I was fixing the garbage disposal. Margot stood in the kitchen doorway, holding her phone like it contained state secrets, her voice carrying that practiced casualness she used when she wanted something. "The girls are planning a wine tasting weekend up in the valley," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Karen found this amazing vineyard that does private tours. Very exclusive." I kept my hands busy with the wrench, listening to the tone more than the words. 20 years of marriage teaches you to read between the lines like a detective examining evidence. "Sounds expensive," I said, because that's what Edward Ashford, network systems contractor, was supposed to say. The practical husband who worried about budgets and thought wine was just grape juice that went bad. "It's not that much, and I never ask for anything." The slight edge in her voice suggested this conversation had been rehearsed. "Besides, you'd be bored out of your mind. All that swirling and sniffing and talking about tannins." She was probably right about that part. My idea of wine appreciation involved checking whether the bottle cost more than $10 and whether it paired well with pizza. But something in her delivery felt off, like an actor who'd memorized the lines but forgot to feel the emotions. "When's this happening?" I asked, finally looking up from the disposal. "This weekend. We're leaving Friday afternoon, coming back Sunday evening." She was already scrolling through her phone, probably coordinating with Karen and Lisa, her usual partners in whatever this really was. I nodded and went back to my wrench. "Have fun with the girls." The relief in her voice was almost audible. "You're the best, Eddie." Nobody who actually cared about me called me Eddie. Friday morning, I watched her pack from the bedroom doorway. The suitcase told a different story than her words had. Wine country in October called for comfortable shoes and layers, maybe a nice sweater for dinner. What I saw going into that bag looked more like a weekend at a resort where the dress code skewed toward impressing someone specific. The black lace lingerie still had price tags. The perfume was the expensive bottle she saved for special occasions that apparently didn't include our anniversary or my birthday. The shoes were heels that would be torture for walking through vineyards, but perfect for intimate dinners. "Packing light?" I asked. She startled, then laughed too quickly. "Karen says the place we're staying has a really nice restaurant. I figured I should bring something decent." "Makes sense." I kept my voice neutral, filing away another piece of evidence in a case I was building without quite admitting it to myself. The departure played out exactly as scripted. Margot loaded her suspicious suitcase into her silver Lexus, kissed my cheek with the enthusiasm of someone checking off a box, and backed out of our driveway with a wave that looked more like relief than affection. I waited exactly 90 minutes. Long enough for her to reach the vineyard if that's where she was actually going. Long enough for me to look like the trusting husband who never questioned his wife's need for female bonding over fermented grapes. The vineyard was easy to find. Hillside Haven Winery, according to the website Margot had left conveniently open on our shared computer. Their tasting room was busy for a Friday afternoon, cars scattered across a gravel lot that offered excellent visibility of every vehicle present. Margot's Lexus wasn't among them. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes, watching wine enthusiasts wander between buildings with glasses in their hands and smiles on their faces. Normal people doing normal things on a normal Friday. The kind of people who actually went to wine tastings when they said they were going to wine tastings. The motel was 3 miles down Route 6. The kind of place that survived on travelers too tired to care about thread counts and couples who paid by the hour. The Sleepy Inn Motor Lodge, according to the faded sign that promised color television and air conditioning like they were luxury amenities. Margot's Lexus sat in the parking lot like evidence at a crime scene. Room 12. The brass numbers hung slightly crooked on a door that had seen better decades. The curtains were drawn, but not quite tight enough to hide the movement of shadows inside. Two people, maybe three, engaged in activities that definitely weren't wine tasting. My phone came out automatically, muscle memory from 20 years of documenting network installations and system failures. The photos were clinical, methodical. License plates, room numbers, time stamps that would contradict any story about vineyard tours and female bonding. A man emerged from the motel office, wiping his hands on a towel that had given up on being white sometime during the previous administration. Earl Vernon, according to the name tag pinned to his shirt. He had the look of someone who'd seen everything twice and found most of it disappointing. "Help you with something?" he asked, but his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Just looking for my wife," I said. "She mentioned staying somewhere around here for a wine tasting weekend." Earl's expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy if it hadn't been filtered through years of managing a roadside motel. "Room 12's been popular this weekend. Real popular." He didn't elaborate, but he didn't need to. The knowing look in his eyes said everything about what kind of wine tasting was happening behind that crooked door. I thanked Earl and walked back to my truck, carrying the weight of confirmation I'd hoped not to find. The drive home passed in a blur of suburban streets and traffic lights, my mind already moving beyond discovery toward what came next. The house felt different when I walked through the front door. Not empty yet, but ready to be. Like a stage set waiting for the next act to begin. I started with my clothes, methodically removing every shirt, every pair of pants, every sock from the closets and drawers we'd shared for 2 decades. The process was therapeutic, each empty hanger a small act of liberation from a marriage that had apparently been over longer than I'd realized. My books came next, then my tools, my files, my coffee mug, my reading glasses. Everything that made the house feel like my home disappeared into boxes and garbage bags, leaving behind only the furniture we'd bought together and the memories I no longer wanted to keep. The lawyer's card went on the kitchen counter, positioned exactly where Margot always dropped her keys when she came home. Douglas Whitmore, family law attorney. A small white rectangle that would communicate more than any conversation we might have had. I was loading the last box into my truck when Mrs. Henderson from next door appeared at her mailbox, timing her mail retrieval to coincide with maximum gossip potential. "Moving day?" she asked, her voice bright with curiosity. "Something like that," I said. "Margot's having a wine tasting weekend with the girls. Thought I'd use the time to reorganize some things." Mrs. Henderson nodded, like this made perfect sense, but I could see the questions forming behind her eyes. 20 years in the same neighborhood had taught me to recognize the look of someone who would be making phone calls as soon as I drove away. Perfect. The apartment I'd rented was a furnished 1-bedroom in a complex that catered to people in transition. Divorce, job changes, life falling apart in manageable monthly installments. The kind of place where nobody asked personal questions and everybody minded their own business. I was arranging my books on the particle board shelves when my phone rang. Margot's name appeared on the screen, but I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened to her message with the detachment of someone reviewing evidence. "Eddie, what's going on? The house looks like it was robbed. Call me back right now." The panic in her voice was real, but so were the photos on my phone. I deleted the message and went back to unpacking. The second call came an hour later. This time I answered. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded, skipping past any pretense of pleasantries. "Hope you enjoyed the tasting," I said, keeping my voice level. "I recommend Room 12's house red." The silence stretched long enough for me to picture her face, the exact moment when she realized that her carefully constructed story had collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. "I don't know what you think you saw," she started. "I think I saw my wife's car at a motel instead of a vineyard," I interrupted. "I think I saw Room 12 with the curtains drawn and shadows moving around inside. I think I took some really interesting photos that tell a completely different story than wine tasting with the girls." Another silence. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted from panic to calculation. "We need to talk." "We really don't," I said. "But you might want to talk to Douglas Whitmore. His card's on the counter." I hung up before she could respond and turned off my phone. Outside my new apartment window, traffic moved along the street in orderly patterns, people going about their normal Friday evening routines. Normal people with normal problems and normal marriages that didn't require private investigators or family law attorneys. I opened a bottle of beer, not wine, never wine again, and sat down to plan what came next. Because this was just the beginning. Margot thought she could have her wine-tasting weekend and her comfortable marriage too, thought she could keep me as the reliable husband while she explored other options in roadside motels. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The photos on my phone were just the opening move. Earl Vernon at the motel had the look of a man who enjoyed sharing interesting stories with the right audience. Mrs. Henderson next door was probably already spreading word about the mysterious moving day. And Douglas Whitmore, family law attorney, specialized in making sure cheating spouses faced appropriate consequences for their choices. Room 12 was about to become the most expensive motel room in Connecticut. Saturday morning brought rain and the kind of gray sky that matched my mood perfectly. I sat in my truck across from what used to be my house, watching Margot's Lexus pull into the driveway like a guilty suspect returning to the scene. She sat in her car for a long moment before getting out, probably rehearsing whatever story she'd constructed during the drive home from her wine-tasting weekend. The suitcase came out of the trunk with less enthusiasm than it had gone in, and her walk to the front door carried the weight of someone who suspected their world was about to change. The key turned. The door opened, and then came the silence. I could picture her standing in our entryway, looking at the empty coat closet, the missing shoes, the absence of everything that had made the house feel occupied by two people instead of one. The lawyer's card would be sitting on the counter like a white flag of surrender, except I was the one who'd raised it. My phone buzzed with a text message. "We need to talk. This is insane." I typed back, "The only insane thing is thinking I wouldn't find out." The response came immediately. "It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think. Room 12 at the Sleepy Inn Motor Lodge. Your car, someone else's car, shadows in the window. Pretty straightforward, really." This time the silence stretched longer. I could imagine her staring at her phone, realizing that denial wasn't going to work when I had photographic evidence of her wine-tasting weekend. Douglas Whitmore's office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house that specialized in the kind of legal problems suburban couples preferred to handle discreetly. The waiting room looked like a therapist's office, all soft colors and comfortable chairs designed to make people feel better about the worst days of their lives. Douglas himself was exactly what I'd hoped for when I'd researched family law attorneys online. Mid-40s, expensive suit, the kind of handshake that suggested competence without overselling it. He looked at the photos on my phone with the detached professionalism of someone who'd seen this story played out hundreds of times before. "Standard adultery documentation," he said, handing the phone back. "Clear evidence of extramarital activity. How long has this been going on?" "I just found out yesterday," I said. "But looking back, probably months, maybe longer." He nodded and made notes on a legal pad. "Any joint assets, property, investments, retirement accounts?" "House, 2 cars, some savings, nothing complicated." I paused. "But I don't just want a divorce. I want her to face consequences for what she's done." Douglas looked up from his notes. "What kind of consequences?" "Social consequences. Professional consequences. I want everyone who knows us to understand exactly what kind of person she really is." I leaned forward. "She works in public relations. Her whole career is built on managing people's reputations. I want her to find out what it feels like when someone else manages hers." A smile flickered across Douglas's face. That's not technically legal advice I can give you. But hypothetically speaking, if certain information were to become public knowledge through appropriate channels, that would be a natural consequence of someone's choices. Hypothetically, I agreed. The motel manager you mentioned, Earl Vernon, he might be willing to provide an affidavit about what he's observed. For a small consideration, of course. Of course. We spent the next hour discussing strategy, timelines, and the various ways a marriage could be dissolved when one party had documented evidence of the other party's extracurricular activities. Connecticut was a no-fault divorce state, but fault still mattered when it came to asset distribution and public perception. One more thing, Douglas said as I was leaving. You mentioned your wife works in PR. Who's her employer? Hartwell Communications. They handle corporate reputation management, crisis communications, that sort of thing. Douglas made another note. Interesting. They're very concerned about their own reputation. Employees who become the center of public scandals tend to find themselves seeking new employment opportunities. The rain had stopped by the time I got back to my truck, but the gray clouds remained. Perfect weather for what I had planned next. Earl Vernon was exactly where I'd expected to find him, sitting behind the desk in the Sleepy Inn Motor Lodge office, reading a newspaper that looked older than the motel itself. He looked up when I walked in, recognition flickering across his weathered face. Back again? He asked. Thought we might have a conversation about room 12, I said, and what you might have observed during this weekend's wine-tasting activities. Earl folded his newspaper and leaned back in his chair. Depends on what kind of conversation you're looking for. I placed $200 on the counter, the kind where you help me understand exactly what's been happening in that room, and maybe provide a written statement about your observations. Earl looked at the money, then at me, then back at the money. You know, now that you mention it, I have been noticing some unusual activity lately. Room 12's been real popular with certain guests. Same cars showing up regular like, always paying cash, always checking in during the afternoon. How regular? Every few weeks, going back maybe 3 months, sometimes longer stays, sometimes just a couple hours. He picked up a registration book and flipped through pages. Your wife's car, that silver Lexus. I've seen it here 6 times since August. 6 times. The number hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. Anyone else? Black BMW, Connecticut plates, belongs to a fellow who signs the register as B. Smith, but his real name's probably something else. They're never very creative with the fake names. Bradley Sinclair. It had to be. I'd seen his BMW parked at the country club where Margot played tennis, seen him at the charity events she dragged me to. Married, 2 kids, owned some kind of import business that made him rich enough to afford expensive cars and roadside motel rooms. Would you be willing to write down what you've observed? I asked. Dates, times, vehicle descriptions, for legal purposes. Earl considered this, then reached for a pen. For another 100, I'd be happy to document my observations. Professional discretion and all that. I added another 100 to the pile and watched him write out a detailed account of room 12's recent history. Names, dates, times, vehicle descriptions, even notes about how long the room was occupied during each visit. The kind of documentation that would make Douglas Whitmore very happy and Margot very unhappy. One more thing, Earl said, handing me the signed statement. They never close the curtains all the way. Room 12's got a gap in the fabric, right at eye level if you're standing by the ice machine. Not that I go looking, you understand, but a man notices things. Of course. Your wife's got a distinctive laugh. Carries real well across the parking lot. I thanked Earl for his professionalism and drove back to my apartment with a folder full of evidence that painted a very clear picture of Margot's wine-tasting weekends. 6 times since August. Regular afternoon visits. A married man named Bradley who thought B. Smith was a clever alias. My phone had been buzzing with ignored calls and text messages all afternoon. Margot, Karen, Lisa, even a number I didn't recognize. The panic was spreading through their little circle like water through a cracked foundation. I finally answered when Margot called for the 10th time. "Where are you?" she demanded. "We need to talk about this like adults." "I'm being very adult about it," I said. "I hired an attorney, gathered evidence, and documented everything properly. Very mature, very responsible. You can't just disappear and leave a lawyer's card like some kind of threat." "It's not a threat. It's information. Douglas Whitmore specializes in cases involving marital infidelity. I thought you should know who you'll be dealing with." "Eddie, please. Let me explain what really happened. What really happened is that you've been having an affair with Bradley Sinclair for at least 3 months, using wine-tasting weekends as cover stories, and meeting him at the Sleepy Inn Motor Lodge every few weeks for activities that have nothing to do with viticulture." The silence that followed was long enough for me to know I'd gotten the name right. Bradley Sinclair, married father of 2, BMW driver, wine enthusiast who preferred motel rooms to vineyard tours. "How did you—" she started. "Earl Vernon has an excellent memory and very detailed records. Amazing what people notice when they're actually paying attention." "You're making a huge mistake," she said, her voice shifting from panic to anger. "You don't understand what you're destroying." "I understand perfectly. I'm destroying a marriage that was already destroyed. I'm just making sure everyone else understands it too." I hung up and turned off my phone. Outside my apartment window, Saturday afternoon traffic moved through the streets in normal patterns. Normal people having normal weekends, probably not dealing with cheating spouses or roadside motel documentation, or family law attorneys who specialized in making bad situations worse for the people who deserved it. The folder on my kitchen table contained enough evidence to end a marriage and probably a career. Earl Vernon's statement, the photographs, the timeline of deception that stretched back months. Douglas Whitmore would turn it into legal ammunition, but that was just the beginning. Margot thought she could manage this crisis like she managed her clients' reputations. Control the narrative, limit the damage, spin the story until it sounded like something other than what it actually was. She was about to learn that some stories couldn't be spun, some reputations couldn't be managed, and some wine-tasting weekends left stains that wouldn't wash out no matter how much professional cleaning you applied. Room 12 was about to become the most famous motel room in Connecticut. Sunday morning brought sunshine and the kind of clear sky that made everything look sharper, more defined. Perfect weather for clarity, for seeing things exactly as they were instead of how you wished they could be. I was drinking coffee in my new apartment when the first call came. Not from Margot this time, but from Karen, her partner in the wine-tasting deception. "Ed, we need to talk," she said, her voice carrying the forced calm of someone trying to manage a crisis. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," I said. "Just a lot of clarity about what's been going on." "Margot is devastated. She made a mistake, but it's not what you think. It was just one weekend, just one moment of weakness." 6 weekends, I corrected, going back to August. Earl Vernon keeps excellent records. The pause told me everything I needed to know about how much Karen actually knew about Margot's extracurricular activities. "Look," Karen continued, "we're all adults here. People make mistakes. That doesn't mean you have to destroy everything." "I'm not destroying anything, I'm just documenting what's already been destroyed." I hung up before she could continue her damage control routine and went back to my coffee. The morning was young, and I had work to do. The Suburban Spotlight was a local online publication that survived on advertising revenue and community gossip. Their Facebook page had 12,000 followers, mostly local residents who enjoyed knowing what their neighbors were up to. The kind of audience that would find the story of Room 12 very interesting indeed. I created an anonymous email account and sent them a simple message. Local PR executive caught in motel affair. Photos and documentation available for serious inquiry. Then I sat back and waited for the machinery of small-town gossip to begin grinding. The response came within 2 hours. Jennifer Walsh, the Spotlight's editor, wanted to meet. She suggested a coffee shop in the next town over, the kind of place where conversations could happen without being overheard by the wrong people. Jennifer was younger than I'd expected, maybe 30, with the eager look of someone who'd studied journalism and ended up covering town council meetings and high school sports. But her eyes sharpened when I showed her the photographs and Earl Vernon's statement. "This is Bradley Sinclair," she said, recognizing him immediately. "He sponsors the Youth Soccer League. His wife runs the charity auction every year." "And Margot Ashford works for Hartwell Communications," I added. "They handle crisis management for half the businesses in the county." Jennifer's smile was the expression of someone who'd just realized they were holding a much bigger story than they'd expected. "You understand that once this is published, there's no taking it back. That's the point. What do you want from this? Besides revenge, I mean." I considered the question. I want people to know who they're really dealing with. Margot built her career on managing other people's reputations. She should understand what it feels like when someone else manages hers. The story went live on Monday morning. Local business leaders caught in motel affair ran with carefully edited versions of my photographs and selected quotes from Earl Vernon's statement. Nothing actionable, nothing that couldn't be defended in court, but enough detail to paint a very clear picture of what had been happening in room 12. The comments section exploded immediately. Neighbors, business associates, people who'd known Margot and Bradley for years expressing shock, disappointment, and the kind of moral outrage that only comes from discovering that people you thought you knew were living completely different lives behind closed doors. My phone started ringing before I'd finished reading the article. Margot's name appeared on the screen every few minutes, but I let every call go to voicemail. The messages grew increasingly desperate as the day progressed. "Eddie, please pick up. This is a disaster. People are calling my office. My boss wants to see me. The neighbors are staring. You have to help me fix this." "You've ruined everything. 20 years of marriage, my career, my reputation. For what? Because you couldn't handle one mistake? I know you're angry, but this has gone too far. Call me back so we can figure out how to handle this." I deleted each message after listening to it and went about my Monday routine. Work calls, system installations, the normal business of keeping computer networks running for clients who had normal problems that could be solved with normal solutions. Douglas Whitmore called around noon. "Saw the article," he said. "Very thorough reporting. Small towns love a good story." Hartwell Communications has been getting calls all morning. Apparently, their clients are concerned about being associated with employees who generate negative publicity. Concerned enough to do something about it? We'll see. But hypothetically speaking, a company that specializes in reputation management wouldn't want their own reputation damaged by association. The hypothetical became reality by Tuesday afternoon. Margot's boss, Richard Hartwell himself, issued a statement about the company's commitment to professional standards and family values. The statement didn't mention Margot by name, but it didn't need to. Everyone who'd read the Suburban Spotlight article understood exactly what kind of professional standards were being discussed. Margot was placed on administrative leave pending a review of her conduct and its impact on the company's reputation. In the PR business, administrative leave was usually just a polite way of saying goodbye. Bradley Sinclair was having his own problems. His import business depended on relationships with family-owned vineyards and distributors who took a dim view of married men who conducted affairs in roadside motels. The Youth Soccer League was reconsidering his sponsorship. His wife had hired her own attorney. But the real damage was social. In a community where reputation mattered more than income, where people knew each other's business and remembered each other's mistakes, being exposed as the kind of person who lied about wine-tasting weekends while conducting affairs in room 12 was a social exile sentence. Karen and Lisa, Margot's accomplices in the deception, found themselves answering uncomfortable questions about their own knowledge of the affair. Their husbands wanted to know what else they'd helped cover up. Their friends wondered what other lies they'd been told. The wine tasting story had unraveled completely, taking their social circle with it. Wednesday brought a knock on my apartment door. I opened it to find Margot standing in the hallway, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her usually perfect hair hung limp around her face, and her clothes looked like she'd grabbed them from the floor. "Can I come in?" she asked. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Please, Eddie, 5 minutes. Let me try to explain." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let her into my small living room. She looked around at my new furniture, my reorganized books, my coffee cup sitting on a table that belonged only to me. "You've really moved on," she said. "I've really moved out. There's a difference." She sat down on my couch without being invited, a familiar gesture from a woman who no longer had the right to make herself comfortable in my space. "I made a mistake," she said. "A terrible, stupid mistake. But it's over now. Bradley ended it yesterday. We can get past this. We can't get past anything. There is no we. 20 years, Eddie. 20 years of marriage. That has to count for something. It counted for something until you decided it didn't. 6 times since August, remember? That's not a mistake. That's a choice you made over and over again." She started crying then. The kind of tears that might have moved me a month ago, but now just looked like another performance. Another attempt to manage the situation, control the narrative, spin the story until it sounded like something forgivable. "I never meant for this to happen," she said. "It just did. Bradley was charming, and you were always working, and I felt lonely. So you felt lonely and decided to cure it with roadside motel affairs while lying to me about wine tasting weekends. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It was just supposed to be a distraction, something that made me feel alive again. Well, congratulations. You're definitely alive now. Alive and unemployed and socially radioactive, but very much alive." She looked up at me with red eyes and a desperate expression. "What do you want? What will it take to make this stop?" "It stops when the divorce is final and we never have to see each other again. I'll fight it. I'll hire my own lawyer and fight for everything. The house, the savings, alimony, everything I'm entitled to. With what money? You're on administrative leave, remember? And Douglas tells me that adultery affects asset distribution, even in no-fault states, especially when it's documented as thoroughly as yours is." The realization hit her face like cold water. She'd been so focused on managing the immediate crisis that she hadn't thought through the long-term consequences. The career damage, the social exile, the financial impact of being the documented cheating spouse in a divorce proceeding. "You've destroyed my life," she said. "I've documented your choices. You destroyed your own life. I just made sure everyone else could see what you'd done." She stood up and walked to the door, then turned back for one last attempt at damage control. "People will get bored with this story eventually. They'll move on to something else. But you'll still be the bitter man who couldn't forgive his wife's mistake. Maybe, but you'll still be the woman who got caught in room 12 with someone else's husband. Some stories stick longer than others." She left without saying goodbye, and I locked the door behind her. Outside my window, Wednesday afternoon traffic moved through the streets in normal patterns. Normal people with normal problems, probably not dealing with the social and professional consequences of roadside motel affairs. The gossip machine was running at full capacity now, fed by new details and fresh outrage every day. Earl Vernon had become something of a local celebrity, giving interviews about his observations and professional discretion. The suburban spotlight was running follow-up stories about the impact on local businesses and community organizations. Room 12 had become a symbol, a cautionary tale about the consequences of thinking you could live 2 different lives in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. But this was still just the beginning. Margot and Bradley thought the worst was over, that they could weather the storm and eventually rebuild their reputations and their lives. They were wrong. The gossip machine was just the opening act. The real show was about to begin. Thursday morning brought the first frost of the season and a clarity that made everything look sharp-edged and unforgiving. Perfect weather for what I had planned. Bradley Sinclair followed a routine as predictable as sunrise. Country club every Thursday morning, tennis with the same partners, lunch at the same table, the kind of schedule that came from having enough money to structure your days around leisure activities. I knew his routine because Margot had complained about it often enough. How Bradley could afford to spend his mornings playing tennis while she had to work for a living. How unfair it was that some people inherited wealth while others had to build careers from scratch. The irony wasn't lost on me now. I waited in the country club parking lot, watching expensive cars arrive and disgorge their well-dressed owners. Tennis bags, golf clubs, the casual confidence that came from membership in places where your name on the roster mattered more than the balance in your checking account. Bradley's black BMW pulled into its usual spot at exactly 9:15. He climbed out wearing tennis whites that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments, checking his phone with the distracted air of someone whose biggest concern was whether his backhand had improved since last week. That was about to change. I followed him into the locker room, timing my entrance for maximum privacy. The morning tennis crowd had already changed and headed to the courts, leaving the space empty except for Bradley and his expensive routine. "Bradley," I said, my voice echoing off the tile walls. He turned, recognition flickering across his face, followed immediately by the kind of panic that comes from being confronted by the husband of your motel room partner. "Ed, I can explain." No need to explain. Earl Vernon already did that. Very detailed explanation, actually. Dates, times, vehicle descriptions, professional thoroughness. Bradley backed against his locker, the confidence draining from his face like water from a broken pipe. "Look, it's over. I ended it yesterday. Margot and I were done." "You're done because you got caught. There's a difference." I stepped closer, not threatening violence, but making it clear that the conversation was happening on my terms now. Bradley pressed harder against the metal locker, the sound echoing through the empty room. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want you to understand something very clearly. You thought you could use my wife for your entertainment and then walk away when it became inconvenient. You thought there wouldn't be consequences. You never meant to get caught, but you did get caught, and now everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are. The kind who lies to his wife, betrays his marriage, and meets other men's wives in roadside motels." Bradley's face had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. "My wife filed for divorce yesterday. My business partners are asking questions. The soccer league canceled my sponsorship. I've lost everything." "Good. That's exactly what should happen to someone who thinks other people's marriages are available for their entertainment." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a printed copy of Earl Vernon's statement, unfolding it slowly while Bradley watched with growing alarm. 6 times, I said, reading from the document. 6 separate occasions when you and my wife used room 12 for activities that had nothing to do with wine tasting. Earl has very detailed records. "Please," Bradley said, his voice cracking. "What do you want me to do? I can't undo what happened. I want you to remember this conversation every time you think about getting involved with someone else's wife. I want you to remember that actions have consequences, and some consequences last longer than others." I folded the statement and put it back in my pocket, then looked Bradley directly in the eyes. "If you ever contact Margot again, if you ever try to resume your little wine-tasting adventures, if you even think about continuing what you started in room 12, I'll make sure the next article in the Suburban Spotlight includes much more detailed information about your activities. Earl Vernon saw a lot more than what made it into the first story." Bradley nodded frantically, understanding that his social and professional exile could get much worse if he made the wrong choice. "We're clear?" I asked. "We're clear." I walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. Oh, and Bradley, you might want to find a new tennis club. I'm thinking about taking up the game myself. I left him standing in the locker room, probably wondering how his Thursday morning routine had transformed from leisure activity to personal nightmare. Outside, the autumn air felt crisp and clean, full of possibilities for what came next. The country club parking lot offered excellent visibility for what I had planned. Bradley's BMW sat in its usual spot, black paint gleaming in the morning sun, the kind of car that announced its owner's success to anyone who cared about such things. I walked over and examined it carefully. Expensive, well-maintained, probably worth more than most people's annual salaries. The kind of vehicle that represented everything Bradley thought was important about himself. The bottle of cheap red wine came from the grocery store across the street. $2 table wine, the kind that came with a screw-off cap and tasted like it had been aged in a plastic container. Nothing like the sophisticated vintages Bradley probably preferred for his wine-tasting adventures. I unscrewed the cap and poured the entire contents into the BMW's air intake vents, watching the red liquid disappear into the car's ventilation system. Every time Bradley turned on his air conditioning or heat, he'd be reminded of his wine-tasting weekends and the consequences of thinking other people's marriages were available for his entertainment. The smell would be impossible to remove completely. Professional cleaning might reduce it, but traces would linger for months, maybe years. A permanent reminder of Room 12 and the choices that had led him there. I was walking back to my truck when Bradley emerged from the country club, probably hoping to escape before anyone else recognized him from the suburban spotlight articles. His step faltered when he saw me standing near his car, then broke into a near run when he realized what I might have been doing. "What did you do?" he demanded, reaching his BMW and immediately noticing the sweet, sour smell beginning to emanate from the vents. "Just sharing some wine," I said. "Thought you might appreciate a vintage that matches your character." He tried the ignition, and the smell intensified as the ventilation system circulated the fermenting grape juice through every duct and filter. His expensive car now smelled like a failed wine-tasting experiment, a rolling reminder of his motel room adventures. "You can't do this," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. We both knew that compared to what he'd done to his own marriage and reputation, a little wine in the air vents was a minor inconvenience. "I just did it," I replied. "Consider it a parting gift. Something to remember me by every time you drive anywhere." Bradley stood in the country club parking lot, surrounded by the cars of people who were probably discussing his affairs and their consequences, breathing in the smell of cheap wine and expensive mistakes. I drove away feeling better than I had in weeks. Not because I'd damaged his car, but because I'd made it clear that actions had consequences, and some consequences couldn't be avoided by hiring better lawyers or finding new tennis clubs. The afternoon brought a call from Douglas Whitmore. "Heard you had a conversation with Mr. Sinclair this morning. Just a friendly chat about wine preferences." I'm sure it was very educational for him. His attorney called my office this afternoon. Apparently, Mr. Sinclair is very eager to finalize his own divorce proceedings and avoid any further publicity about his extracurricular activities. Sounds like he's learned something about consequences. Indeed. And speaking of consequences, Hartwell Communications made their decision about your wife's employment status. Administrative leave has become permanent leave. They're very concerned about maintaining their reputation for professional standards. Margot's career was over. 20 years of building relationships and managing other people's reputations, destroyed by her own choices and their inevitable consequences. The woman who specialized in crisis management had created a crisis she couldn't manage. "Any word from Margot herself?" Douglas asked. "She stopped by yesterday, wanted to discuss reconciliation and forgiveness. I explained that some things can't be reconciled and some choices can't be forgiven. Probably for the best. The divorce proceedings will be much simpler if both parties understand that the marriage is irretrievably broken." That evening, I sat in my apartment reading the latest Suburban Spotlight article about the ongoing fallout from the Room 12 scandal. Bradley's business was losing clients. Margot was unemployed and unemployable in the local PR industry. Karen and Lisa were dealing with their own marital problems as their husbands questioned what else they'd helped cover up. The wine-tasting weekend had become a cautionary tale about the consequences of thinking you could live two different lives in a community where everyone knew everyone else's business. But I wasn't done yet. Physical payback was satisfying, but it was just one part of a larger plan. Margot and Bradley thought they'd hit bottom, that the worst was over and they could begin the slow process of rebuilding their lives and reputations. They were wrong. The real reckoning was still coming. Room 12 was about to become even more famous. Friday morning brought news that made my coffee taste even better than usual. The Suburban Spotlight had published a follow-up story about the business impact of the Room 12 scandal, complete with quotes from Bradley's former clients and Margot's former colleagues. Apparently, reputation management worked both ways. When you specialized in protecting other people's reputations, having your own reputation destroyed became a professional liability that clients couldn't overlook. I was reading the article when my phone rang. Unknown number, but I answered anyway. This is Detective Paula Green, Connecticut State Police. I'd like to speak with you about an incident involving Bradley Sinclair's vehicle. My stomach tightened, but I kept my voice level. What kind of incident? Mr. Sinclair filed a complaint about vandalism to his car, claims someone poured wine into his air vents, says he has reason to believe you were responsible. That's an interesting theory. What evidence does he have? He says you were seen near his vehicle yesterday morning at the country club, says you threatened him in the locker room. I considered my options. Denial would be the safe play, but something in Detective Green's tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by Bradley's story. I did have a conversation with Mr. Sinclair yesterday, I said, about his relationship with my wife and the impact it's had on my marriage. As for his car, I wouldn't know anything about that. Would you be willing to come in and make a formal statement? Of course. When would be convenient? We arranged to meet that afternoon at the State Police Barracks. I spent the morning consulting with Douglas Whitmore about the legal implications of Bradley's complaint and the best way to handle Detective Green's questions. Deny everything specific. Acknowledge only what can be proven, Douglas advised. You had a conversation with Sinclair, but you didn't vandalize his car. You were in the parking lot, but so were dozens of other people. Stay calm, stick to the facts, and remember that Sinclair has every reason to want you in legal trouble. Detective Green turned out to be a woman in her 40s with the kind of direct gaze that came from years of sorting truth from lies. She led me into an interview room that smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee, the kind of place where people's stories either held up under scrutiny or fell apart completely. Tell me about your conversation with Bradley Sinclair, she began. I wanted to discuss his relationship with my wife and the impact it was having on my marriage. We talked for maybe 5 minutes in the country club locker room. Did you threaten him? I explained that his actions had consequences and that those consequences would continue if he didn't change his behavior. What kind of consequences? Social consequences. Professional consequences. The kind that come naturally when people find out you've been conducting affairs with other men's wives. Detective Green made notes on a pad, her expression giving nothing away. And after this conversation, you went to the parking lot? I went to my truck and drove home. Mr. Sinclair says you were seen near his vehicle. The parking lot wasn't very crowded. I probably walked past several vehicles on my way to my truck. Did you pour wine into his air vents? No. The denial was technically true. I'd poured wine into his air intake vents, which were different from air vents in the same way that adultery was different from wine tasting. A distinction that might matter to someone who cared about precision. Detective Green studied me for a long moment, then closed her notepad. Mr. Sinclair's complaint is that someone vandalized his car in retaliation for his relationship with your wife. But vandalism requires proof of intentional damage, and what happened to his car doesn't really qualify as damage. Unpleasant, yes. Expensive to clean, probably, but not criminal. So, no charges? No charges. But I'd suggest avoiding any further contact with Mr. Sinclair. He's looking for reasons to cause you legal problems, and it's better not to give him any. I thanked Detective Green for her professionalism and drove back to my apartment feeling like I'd dodged a bullet. Bradley was desperate enough to involve the police, which meant the social and professional consequences were hitting him harder than I'd expected. Good. That was exactly what should happen to someone who thought other people's marriages were available for their entertainment. But Bradley's desperation also made him dangerous. Desperate people made poor decisions, and poor decisions led to confrontations that could escalate beyond anyone's control. I was thinking about this when I noticed the black BMW following me through suburban traffic. Not obviously following, but making the same turns, stopping at the same lights, maintaining the same distance. The kind of surveillance that might work on someone who wasn't already paranoid about Bradley's intentions. I took a detour through a residential neighborhood, watching my mirrors as the BMW maintained its position 3 cars back. When I turned into a shopping center parking lot, Bradley followed, confirming what I'd suspected. He wanted a confrontation. Probably figured that if he could provoke me into doing something stupid, he could get me arrested and shift the narrative away from his own choices and their consequences. The shopping center was busy enough to provide witnesses, but not so crowded that a conversation couldn't happen. I parked near the main entrance and waited for Bradley to make his move. He pulled up 2 spaces away, climbed out of his wine-scented BMW, and walked over with the aggressive stride of someone who'd been practicing this confrontation in his head. "We need to talk," he said. "We talked yesterday. I thought we understood each other. You ruined my car. You threatened me. You've destroyed my reputation and my business. This has gone far enough. Your reputation destroyed itself when you decided to conduct affairs in roadside motels. I just made sure people knew about it." Bradley stepped closer, his face flushed with anger and desperation. "I want you to back off. Stop the articles, stop the gossip, stop whatever campaign you're running against me." "I'm not running any campaign. I'm just letting people know what kind of person they're dealing with." "You're ruining my life." "You ruined your own life. I'm just documenting the process." That's when Bradley made his mistake. He grabbed my shirt, trying to intimidate me into backing down, probably thinking that physical confrontation would somehow solve his reputation problems. I stepped back, breaking his grip, and spoke loudly enough for the growing crowd of shoppers to hear clearly. "I don't want any trouble, Bradley. I just want you to leave me alone and stay away from my wife." "Your wife came to me," he said, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "She was the one who wanted to meet at the motel. She was the one who suggested the wine-tasting story." The admission hung in the air like a confession at a public trial. Several people had stopped to watch, their phones out, probably recording the whole exchange. Bradley had just confirmed every detail of the Room 12 scandal in front of witnesses who would undoubtedly share what they'd heard. "So, you're saying you and my wife conducted an affair, using wine-tasting weekends as cover stories?" I asked, making sure the crowd could hear every word. Bradley realized his mistake too late. "That's not what I meant." "You meant that you met my wife at the Sleepy Inn Motor Lodge multiple times over several months, lying to both our spouses about wine-tasting activities that never actually happened?" "Stop twisting my words." "I'm not twisting anything. I'm just repeating what you said in front of all these witnesses." Bradley looked around at the crowd, realizing that his attempt at intimidation had become a public confession that would be all over social media within hours. His face went pale as he understood that he'd just made his reputation problems much worse. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," I replied. It's been over since the moment you got caught. Everything that's happened since then has just been consequences. Bradley walked back to his BMW, climbed in, and drove away with the smell of cheap wine following him like a cloud of bad decisions. The crowd began to disperse, but not before several people approached me to express their support and share their opinions about married men who conducted affairs with other people's wives. By evening, video of Bradley's parking lot confession was circulating on local social media accounts. The Suburban Spotlight published another article, this one featuring quotes from witnesses who'd heard Bradley admit to the affair and confirm the details of the wine-tasting deception. The story had taken on a life of its own, fed by Bradley's own words and witnessed by people who had no reason to protect his reputation. He'd tried to intimidate me into silence, and instead had provided public confirmation of everything he'd been trying to deny. Margot called that night, her voice shaking with rage. "What did you do to Bradley?" she demanded. "I had a conversation with him in a shopping center parking lot. He did most of the talking. He's been getting calls all evening. People saw the video. His lawyer says it's going to make his divorce much more expensive. Sounds like he should have thought about that before he grabbed my shirt and started confessing to adultery in front of witnesses. You planned this. You followed him, you provoked him, you made him look bad on purpose. I didn't make him look bad. He looked bad all by himself. I just gave him the opportunity to demonstrate what kind of person he really is." The conversation ended with Margot hanging up on me, but not before I heard the desperation in her voice. Her partner in wine-tasting adventures was falling apart under the pressure of social and professional consequences, and his collapse was making her own situation worse. Bradley's public confession had confirmed every detail of their affair and eliminated any possibility of spinning the story into something more innocent. They were both exposed now, their reputations destroyed by their own choices and their inability to handle the consequences with any dignity. But the chase wasn't over yet. Desperate people made increasingly poor decisions, and Bradley was about to discover just how much worse his situation could become. Room 12 was becoming a legend, and legends had a way of growing larger with each retelling. Saturday morning brought the kind of crisp October weather that made everything feel possible. The leaves were turning, the air was clear, and the annual Harvest Festival was setting up in the town square with the organized chaos of a community event that had been running for decades. I was drinking coffee and reading the latest Suburban Spotlight article when Douglas Whitmore called with news that made the morning even better. "Margot's attorney contacted my office yesterday," he said. "She wants to discuss settlement terms." "What kind of terms?" "Complete surrender, basically. She'll accept whatever asset division we propose in exchange for expedited proceedings and minimal publicity. Her lawyer says she wants to put this behind her as quickly as possible." Probably smart. The longer this drags out, the more opportunities there are for additional embarrassing revelations. Indeed. There's one more thing. Bradley Sinclair's business is filing for bankruptcy. Apparently, his clients have been canceling contracts all week, and his wife's divorce attorney has frozen most of his liquid assets. The wine import business was finished. 20 years of building relationships with vineyards and distributors, destroyed by a few months of roadside motel adventures and the inability to keep his mouth shut when confronted by consequences. Any word on what he's planning to do next? His attorney mentioned something about relocating to another state, starting over somewhere his reputation hasn't preceded him. Running away, the final admission that his situation was irretrievable and his social exile was permanent. Bradley Sinclair, wine enthusiast and motel room regular, was about to become Bradley Sinclair, unemployed exile looking for somewhere to hide from his own choices. I finished my coffee and headed to the Harvest Festival. Not because I particularly enjoyed community events, but because I wanted to see how Margot and her accomplices were handling their first public appearance since the Room 12 scandal had exploded across local social media. The festival was in full swing by the time I arrived. Food trucks, craft vendors, live music, and the kind of forced community spirit that came from people trying to pretend their neighbors weren't discussing their personal scandals behind their backs. I spotted Karen first, standing near the apple cider booth with the uncomfortable posture of someone who knew they were being watched and discussed. Her husband stood beside her with the grim expression of a man who'd learned that his wife had been an accessory to adultery and deception. Lisa was harder to find, probably because she was actively avoiding public spaces where people might ask uncomfortable questions about her role in the wine-tasting cover story. Smart strategy, but ultimately futile in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Margot was nowhere to be seen, which suggested she'd finally developed some situational awareness about her social status. Appearing at a community event where half the attendees had read detailed accounts of her motel room activities would have been social suicide. But Bradley was there, standing near the wine-tasting booth with the kind of desperate determination that suggested he thought public appearances might somehow rehabilitate his reputation. He was talking to anyone who would listen, probably trying to explain his side of the story to people who'd already made up their minds about what kind of person conducted affairs in roadside motels. I bought a cup of coffee and found a bench where I could observe without being obvious about it. The festival continued around me, normal people having normal conversations about normal community concerns. But underneath the surface pleasantries, I could feel the current of gossip and judgment that had been flowing since the Suburban Spotlight published its first article about Room 12. That's when I noticed Megan Sinclair approaching Bradley's position near the wine booth, his wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, walking with the purposeful stride of someone who had something important to say and didn't care who heard it. The conversation was brief but loud enough to carry across the immediate area. Megan's voice, sharp with months of accumulated anger, cut through the festival noise like a knife through fabric. "Still trying to convince people you're a victim?" she asked, her words carrying to everyone within 20 feet. Bradley tried to lower his voice, probably hoping to avoid another public scene, but Megan wasn't interested in discretion. 20 years of marriage, she continued, her voice rising. 2 children who have to explain to their friends why their father's affairs are being discussed on social media, and you're standing here acting like you're the one who's been wronged. Megan, please, not here. Why not here? You didn't care about public embarrassment when you were meeting other men's wives in motel rooms. You didn't worry about our family's reputation when you were lying about business trips and wine tastings. The crowd around the wine booth had stopped pretending not to listen. Phones were out, probably recording another public confession that would be circulating on social media within minutes. "You want to know what kind of man my husband is?" Megan asked, addressing the growing audience directly. "He's the kind who thinks other people's marriages are available for his entertainment. The kind who lies to his wife, his children, his business partners, and anyone else who gets in the way of what he wants." Bradley tried to walk away, but Megan followed, her voice carrying across the festival grounds. "He's also the kind of man who keeps detailed records of his affairs," she announced. "Text messages, hotel receipts, photographs, evidence that his divorce attorney is very interested in reviewing." That stopped Bradley in his tracks. He turned back to face his wife with an expression of complete panic. "What photographs?" he asked. "The ones on your phone, the ones you thought you'd deleted, the ones my attorney's technical expert recovered from your backup files." The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the spectacle of a marriage dissolving in real time at a community festival. Bradley stood in the center of it all, realizing that his situation had just become much worse than public embarrassment and business failure. "You had no right." "I had every right. 20 years of marriage gave me the right to know what my husband was really doing during his wine-tasting weekends." Megan reached into her purse and pulled out a folder thick with documents. Financial records, hotel receipts, phone logs, photographs, everything my attorney needs to make sure you get exactly what you deserve in our divorce settlement. She scattered the papers at Bradley's feet, letting the wind carry them across the festival grounds like evidence of a life lived dishonestly. People bent to pick up the scattered documents, reading details about affairs and deceptions that made the suburban spotlight articles look restrained by comparison. Bradley tried to gather the papers, but there were too many and too much wind. His private correspondence was literally blowing through a public festival, being read by neighbors and strangers who would remember every embarrassing detail. "This is what consequences look like," Megan announced to the crowd. "This is what happens when you think you can lie to everyone who trusts you and never face any punishment for your choices." She walked away, leaving Bradley surrounded by scattered evidence of his dishonesty and a crowd of people who now knew more about his personal life than they'd ever wanted to know. I finished my coffee and stood up to leave, but not before walking past Bradley's position near the wine booth. He was still trying to collect the scattered papers, his face red with embarrassment and exertion. "Looks like wine tasting season is over," I said. He looked up at me with the expression of a man who'd finally understood that some consequences couldn't be avoided, managed, or explained away. "You did this," he said. "You orchestrated all of this." "I didn't orchestrate anything. I just documented what you'd already done and let people draw their own conclusions. My life is ruined. Your life is exactly what you made it. The only difference is that now everyone else can see it too." I walked away, leaving Bradley to collect his scattered secrets in front of a crowd that would be discussing his humiliation for months to come. The festival continued around us, normal people having normal conversations, but the story of Room 12 had just gained another chapter that would be retold and embellished until it became local legend. By evening, video of Megan's confrontation was trending on local social media. The scattered documents had been photographed and shared, providing even more detailed evidence of Bradley's affairs and financial deceptions. His complete social and professional destruction was now documented in real time, witnessed by an entire community that had watched him fall from respected businessman to public embarrassment. Margot called that night, her voice hollow with defeat. "It's over," she said. "Bradley's leaving town. His business is finished. My career is finished. Everything we built is gone. Everything you built was based on lies. This is just what happens when the lies stop working. What do you want from me, Eddie? What will it take to make you stop? I want you to sign the divorce papers and disappear from my life. That's what I've wanted since the moment I found your car at the Sleepy Inn Motor Lodge." "And then this ends?" "Then this ends." The papers were signed the following Tuesday. Margot got her clothes, her car, and enough money to start over somewhere else. I got the house, most of the savings, and the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served by the simple act of letting people know the truth about what had been happening in Room 12. Douglas Whitmore called that afternoon to confirm that the divorce was final and all assets had been transferred according to our agreement. "Margot's attorney mentioned that she's planning to relocate," he said. "Apparently she's found a position with a PR firm in another state. Somewhere her reputation hasn't preceded her. Good for her. Everyone deserves a chance to start over." "Very generous of you, considering what she put you through." "I'm not generous. I'm just done. The story's over, the consequences have been delivered, and I can get back to living my life without worrying about what lies I'm being told." That evening, I drove past the Sleepy Inn Motor Lodge on my way home from work. Earl Vernon was sitting in his usual spot behind the front desk, probably reading the same newspaper and waiting for the next interesting story to unfold in his parking lot. Room 12 was empty, its curtains open to reveal a space that looked smaller and shabbier than it had when it contained the secrets that destroyed 2 marriages and several careers. Just another motel room in a roadside establishment that specialized in temporary accommodations for people who needed privacy for activities they couldn't conduct at home. But it would always be Room 12 to me. The place where my wife's lies had finally caught up with her reality, where Bradley Sinclair had learned that other people's marriages weren't available for his entertainment, and where the simple act of telling the truth had proven more powerful than any revenge I could have planned. The story was over. the consequences had been delivered. And somewhere in Connecticut, a roadside motel room had become a legend about what happened when people thought they could live two different lives in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Some wines get better with age. Some marriages reveal their true composition only when examined by professionals trained to identify fraud. And some stories end exactly where they should, with truth triumphant and justice served by the simple act of letting people see what had been hidden in the shadows. Room 12. The most expensive motel room in Connecticut.